Weathered cabin walls stood silent against the mountain backdrop as 10-year-old Thomas sat cross-legged on the porch, small fingers tracing the contours of a strange rock his grandfather had left him. Once part of a bustling family, he now lived in quiet isolation, abandoned by relatives who couldn't understand his devotion to what they called a worthless piece of earth. Only Rex, his loyal German shepherd, remained by his side, watching with patient eyes as autumn surrendered to winter's first assault. When morning frost covered the ground, Rex's urgent barking woke Thomas, leading him through the frozen forest to a discovery that would forever change their lives. What ancient secret had his grandfather tried to preserve through this innocent boy? Could a child's faith and a dog's instinct uncover what an entire family had dismissed? Would those who abandoned Thomas return when they learned the truth about his seemingly worthless inheritance? 3 months had passed since Grandfather Miller's funeral, and 10-year-old Thomas found himself alone in the mountainside cabin save for Rex, the loyal German shepherd who remained his only companion. The family's departure still burned fresh in his memory. His uncle's disgusted face, his cousin's mocking laughter, his aunt's disappointed sigh as they packed their belongings into their sedan. "That worthless rock over your own family," his uncle had spat, pointing at the rough stone clutched in Thomas's small hand. "You've got your grandfather's foolishness. Don't come crying to us when winter sets in." They'd left him with minimal provisions and the legal guardianship papers hastily signed over to Eleanor, the elderly neighbor who lived 2 miles down the mountain road and checked on him twice weekly. Thomas sat now by the crackling fireplace, watching the first snowflakes of winter swirl outside the frost-edged windows, his breath forming small clouds in the cabin's growing chill. The stone, gray with odd bluish veins running through its core, rested heavily in his palm as he recalled his grandfather's final labored words. "This is more than it seems, Thomas. They'll come looking for it someday. Trust no one but yourself and Rex. The truth lies beneath." The old man had slipped away before finishing, leaving Thomas with an enigmatic inheritance and a desperate, clinging hope that his grandfather hadn't been delirious at the end. He'd begun to doubt himself during lonely nights when the wind howled against the cabin walls, like his family's accusations. School had become an ordeal of whispered comments and pitying glances from teachers who believed the story that Thomas had chosen to live with a neighbor rather than move to the city with his family. Only Miss Carter, the science teacher, treated him normally, praising his knowledge of the mountain's flora and fauna, knowledge grandfather had painstakingly instilled in him during their woodland expeditions. Thomas stoked the fire with another log from the dwindling pile, mentally calculating how long his supplies would last. The pantry held enough canned goods for weeks, but the firewood would need replenishing soon. He'd have to venture into the forest tomorrow, dragging the small sled his grandfather had built for hauling timber. Rex whined softly and nudged Thomas's elbow, his intelligent eyes seeming to sense the boy's melancholy thoughts. "It's okay, boy," Thomas whispered, scratching behind the shepherd's ears. "We've got each other." And this, he held up the rock, watching how the firelight played across its surface, occasionally revealing flecks that glinted like stars in the night sky. Sometimes, when he held it just right, the stone seemed to pulse with warmth beyond what his small fingers imparted. Grandfather wouldn't have lied, not about something important enough to mention with his dying breath. Tomorrow, Thomas decided, he would examine the rock more carefully in daylight. Perhaps there was writing or markings he'd overlooked. Perhaps there was something, anything, that would justify his choice to stay, to honor his promise, to believe that this seemingly worthless inheritance held value beyond what eyes could see. Outside, the snowfall intensified, blanketing the world in pristine white, erasing boundaries and reshaping the familiar landscape into something new and mysterious, much like the future that stretched before the boy who clutched a secret in his small, determined hands. Morning arrived with a crystalline brilliance that only fresh snow can bring. The world transformed into a glittering expanse of white that momentarily lifted Thomas's spirits as he zipped his grandfather's oversized jacket and pulled a worn woolen hat over his ears. Breakfast had been simple, a bowl of oatmeal shared with Rex, who now bounded excitedly around Thomas's legs as the boy prepared for their firewood-gathering expedition, the small wooden sled bumping against his heels. The forest welcomed them with hushed reverence, snow dampening every sound except the crunch of Thomas's boots and Rex's occasional snuffling as they ventured deeper among the towering pines. They had gathered several armfuls of fallen branches when Rex suddenly froze, his ears perked forward and body tense with alertness. Before Thomas could call him back, the shepherd bolted through the trees, his bark echoing sharply against the silent woodland. "Rex, wait," Thomas called, dropping his load and stumbling after his only friend, fear clutching at his chest as the dog disappeared from sight. Following the urgent barking, Thomas pushed through snow-laden branches until he emerged into a small clearing, where Rex was frantically digging at something half-buried beneath a fallen log, snow flying in all directions from his powerful paws. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked breathlessly, falling to his knees beside the dog whose claws had exposed a corner of something metal and rust-colored. His heart racing, Thomas joined in the excavation, his small fingers quickly growing numb as he brushed away packed snow and frozen earth until the object revealed itself. A metal box about the size of his grandfather's tackle box, its surface corroded but the sturdy lock still intact. "How did you know this was here?" Thomas whispered to Rex, who merely whined and nudged the box with his nose. With trembling hands, Thomas tried to pry the box open, but the lock held firm despite its aged appearance. Remembering his grandfather's workshop tools, he decided to take the mysterious container home, struggling to balance it on the sled along with the meager collection of firewood. Back in the cabin, Thomas worked diligently with an old screwdriver and hammer until the lock finally surrendered with a reluctant crack that sent his pulse racing with anticipation. Inside, protected by a layer of oilcloth that had kept the contents remarkably preserved, lay a folded yellowed paper, and beneath it, a black and white photograph that made Thomas gasp aloud. His grandfather's face stared back at him, much younger but unmistakable, standing proudly beside a tall, severe-looking man Thomas had never seen before. Both men stood at the entrance of what appeared to be a mountain cave, their expressions serious but their posture suggesting a shared purpose. "Who is he, Rex?" Thomas murmured, studying the stranger's face for any hint of familiarity. With careful fingers, he unfolded the paper to reveal a hand-drawn map of the mountain, the familiar contours of ridges and valleys, meticulously rendered with faded ink, but overlaid with symbols and markings that made no immediate sense. X marks and dotted lines traversed the terrain, with one particular location circled repeatedly near what Thomas recognized as the north face, not far from where they'd found the box itself. Along the margins were scribbled notes in his grandfather's distinctive handwriting, some too faded to decipher, but one phrase stood out clearly. "The blue vein runs deeper than they know." Thomas's fingers instinctively sought the rock in his pocket, its bluish veins suddenly taking on new significance as he spread the map across the cabin floor. Could this be what grandfather meant by more than it seems? The coincidence of Rex finding this box buried in snow seemed too perfect to be mere chance. Outside, the winter day was already fading toward dusk, but Thomas felt a growing warmth inside that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. For the first time since being abandoned, he felt a stirring of purpose, a connection to his grandfather that transcended the simple possession of a mysterious rock. 3 days after discovering the metal box, the unusual sound of tires crunching through snow drew Thomas to the cabin window where an unexpected sight greeted him. A sleek black car navigating the rarely used access road that wound up to the property. Rex immediately tensed beside him, a low growl rumbling in his throat as the vehicle came to a precise stop in front of the cabin. Thomas watched anxiously as a tall man in an immaculate charcoal suit emerged, his polished leather shoes incongruous against the snowy backdrop as he surveyed the property with calculating eyes. Something about the stranger's confident posture made Thomas instinctively slide the map under his grandfather's worn copy of Wilderness Survival before opening the door to the man's sharp knock. "Good afternoon, young man," the visitor said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes as he extended a business card. "My name is Richard Hargrove, representing Alpine Peak Resources." "I was hoping to speak with the property owner." Thomas stood straighter, chin lifting slightly as he replied, "My grandfather owned this land. He's gone now." "Mr." Hargrove's smile faltered momentarily before returning with practiced precision. "Yes, I'm aware of Mr. Miller's passing. My sincere condolences. Perhaps I could speak with your parents or guardian." The silence that followed hung heavy between them until Thomas reluctantly invited him inside, Rex shadowing his every move with unblinking vigilance. The man's eyes swept the cabin's modest interior before settling into grandfather's old armchair without invitation. "Our company has had interest in this mountain range for some time," Hargrove explained, removing a sleek leather portfolio from his briefcase. "We're prepared to make a very generous offer for the property, one that would certainly provide a more comfortable living situation for a young man such as yourself." He named a sum that made Thomas's eyes widen. Despite his determination to remain impassive, the amount enough to buy 10 cabins like this one and still have money left over for college someday. "The property isn't for sale," Thomas said quietly, fingers unconsciously seeking the reassuring presence of the rock in his pocket. Hargrove's gaze sharpened at the movement, his attention suddenly fixed on Thomas's hand. "What's that you have there, son?" he asked, his casual tone belied by the intensity of his stare. Thomas hesitated, then reluctantly revealed the stone, its blue veins catching the afternoon light streaming through the window. The change in Hargrove was instantaneous, a tightening around his eyes, a slight forward lean of his body, fingers gripping his portfolio with whitened knuckles. "Interesting specimen," he said, voice carefully controlled yet unable to mask an undercurrent of excitement. "Found it nearby, did you? There might be more where that came from." "All the more reason our offer is quite fair," Rex growled again, moving closer to Thomas, who closed his fingers around the rock protectively. "It was my grandfather's." "It's not for sale either," he stated firmly, a chill running down his spine at the naked hunger that flashed briefly across Hargrove's face before his professional mask slid back into place. The man stood abruptly, straightening his tie with manicured fingers. "Here's my card. When your guardian realizes what an opportunity this is, have them call me. The offer won't remain open indefinitely." As the black card disappeared down the mountain road, Thomas locked the door with trembling hands, the certainty settling in his stomach like a stone. Whatever secret his grandfather had protected was now more endangered than ever. The morning after Hargrove's visit found Thomas trudging through knee-deep snow toward Eleanor Blackwood's cottage, the weight of the rock in one pocket and the folded map in another keeping him anchored against the biting winter wind. Eleanor had been his grandfather's oldest friend, a woman of indeterminate elderly age with hands gnarled like tree roots and eyes that still sparkled with a young person's curiosity. Her small cottage appeared gradually through the snow-laden pines, smoke curling invitingly from its stone chimney as Rex bounded ahead, already familiar with this welcoming destination from their bi-weekly check-ins. The door swung open before Thomas could knock, Eleanor's weathered face breaking into a smile that quickly sobered when she noted his expression. "You've had a visitor," she stated rather than asked, ushering him into the warmth of her home that smelled perpetually of pine needles and freshly baked bread. Thomas nodded, gratefully accepting the steaming mug of hot chocolate she pressed into his cold hands before settling into her rocking chair, a handmade quilt drawn across her knees. "A man named Hargrove came yesterday. He wanted to buy grandfather's land," Thomas explained, carefully extracting the business card and placing it on the small table between them. Eleanor didn't touch it, instead staring at the embossed logo as if it were a venomous snake. "Alpine Peak Resources," she read aloud, her voice taking on a hardness Thomas had never heard before. "Your grandfather warned me about them. Said if anything happened to him, men in expensive suits might come asking questions, making offers too good to refuse." Thomas's heart quickened as he produced the rock from his pocket. He seemed especially interested in this. Eleanor took the stone gingerly, turning it over in her gnarled fingers with knowing eyes. "Joseph never told me exactly what he found up there, but he was certain it was something these mining folks would destroy the whole mountain to get their hands on." She returned the rock to Thomas with a solemn nod. He made his choice to protect whatever secret lies in these mountains, even when it cost him his own family's understanding. Thomas swallowed hard against the lump forming in his throat. "Do you think that's why they left me? Because they knew something about the rock?" Eleanor's eyes softened with compassion. "People fear what they don't understand, Thomas. Your uncle always wanted the easy path. Selling the land would have given him that." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There's someone who might know more. Old Jim Brenner. Used to work the mines before they closed. Lives in that ramshackle cabin past Thunder Ridge. He and your grandfather spent weeks exploring the North Face caves many years ago." She pressed a small package of food into his hands as Thomas prepared to leave, the winter day already beginning its early surrender to dusk. "Be careful who you trust with Joseph's secret, Thomas. Whatever he found was important enough to keep hidden, even from those he loved." As Thomas stepped back into the cold, Eleanor's parting words followed him like a shadow. "The mountain has always protected those who protect it. Your grandfather understood that. I think you do too." Dawn broke with reluctant fingers of pale light stretching across a sky heavy with the promise of more snow as Thomas prepared for the journey to old Jim's cabin. The distance wasn't great as the crow flies, perhaps 5 miles along the ridge, but the winter-transformed landscape and rugged terrain would make it challenging for his small legs. Thomas studied the map carefully before tucking it securely inside his jacket, alongside his grandfather's compass and the mysterious rock that seemed to grow warmer against his chest with each passing day. With Rex trotting faithfully beside him, and a small backpack containing water, Eleanor's food parcel, and a flashlight, Thomas set out along the rarely used forest trail that would eventually connect with the wider path leading to Thunder Ridge. The morning passed in companionable silence, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath Thomas's boots and Rex's occasional investigative detours to examine interesting scents. They had covered perhaps half the distance when the shepherd suddenly froze, ears pricked forward, body rigid with alertness. Thomas stilled immediately, trusting the dog's superior senses, and that's when he heard it, the distant purr of an engine moving slowly along the logging road that ran parallel to their trail, just visible through the trees. Instinctively, Thomas drew back into the shadow of a large pine, pulling Rex close as a sleek black vehicle crept into view, its windows tinted dark against the winter brightness. It was Hargrove's car, or one identical to it, moving at an unnaturally slow pace as if searching for something or someone. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs as his mind raced through the limited options. Continuing forward would mean crossing an exposed clearing visible from the road, while turning back would mean wasted hours and the risk of being followed home. Time for grandfather's ghost walk, he whispered to Rex, remembering the tracking and evasion skills the old man had taught him during their wilderness excursions. Moving with deliberate care, Thomas led Rex deeper into the forest, away from their original path but still roughly in the direction of Thunder Ridge. He walked backwards in his own footprints where possible, stepped only on stones or fallen logs, and used overhanging branches to brush away their tracks, all techniques his grandfather had practiced with him as both survival skills and games. The pair descended into a shallow ravine where a half-frozen stream provided a pathway that left minimal traces, the icy water numbing Thomas's feet through his boots but carrying them swiftly away from their pursuer. After what felt like hours of careful navigation, constant listening, and heart-stopping moments when distant engine sounds seemed to draw near, they emerged onto the far side of Thunder Ridge without sign of the black car. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm Thomas as they climbed the final slope toward the plume of wood smoke that marked old Jim's cabin, his small body pushed to its limits by the combination of physical exertion and constant fear. Rex pressed reassuringly against his leg, as if understanding his young master's fatigue, the loyal dog showing no signs of tiring despite their circuitous journey. As the rustic cabin came into view, little more than a weathered shack clinging to the mountainside like a determined barnacle, Thomas felt a curious mixture of apprehension and hope. Whatever secrets his grandfather had protected, whatever value the rock held that made men in expensive cars hunt through mountain forests, old Jim Brenner might hold the answers that would make sense of the bewildering situation in which Thomas now found himself. Old Jim Brenner's weathered face, creased by decades of mountain living and hard labor, transformed from suspicious wariness to astonishment as his gnarled fingers turned the rock in the amber glow of his cabin's oil lamps. Thomas watched anxiously as the elderly miner examined the stone with expert eyes, occasionally muttering under his breath while Rex settled contentedly before the crackling wood stove, the only modern convenience in Jim's Spartan dwelling. "Where'd you get this, boy?" Jim finally asked, his voice rough as gravel yet soft with reverence. When Thomas explained about his grandfather's final gift and the recently discovered map, Jim's roomy eyes filled with unexpected moisture. "Your granddad Joseph was the finest man I ever knew," he said, carefully unfolding the map across his rough-hewn table. "Saved my life back in '87 when the north shaft collapsed. Everyone else ran out, but Joseph ran in, dragged me from under a support beam seconds before the whole tunnel gave way." His calloused finger traced the blue markings on the map with reverent precision. "Been wondering when you'd show up. Joseph told me he'd leave breadcrumbs for you to follow if anything happened to him." Jim held the rock up to his single electric bulb, squinting at the blue veins running through it. "What you've got here is no ordinary stone, son. These blue streaks contain trace amounts of neodymium scandium tantalum, NST for short. Rarest combination of minerals on Earth, and this particular composition makes it uniquely valuable for certain advanced technologies." He lowered the rock and fixed Thomas with an intense stare. "This little sample alone would fetch thousands from the right buyer, but it's nothing compared to what it represents. Jim tapped a weathered fingernail against the circled area on the map. Your grandfather discovered an NST vein running through the North Face Caverns, possibly the largest untapped deposit in North America. Worth millions, maybe billions to companies like Alpine Peak. The old miner's face darkened as he continued. But mining it conventionally would mean stripping the entire mountainside, damming the Valley River, destroying everything for 50 square miles. Joseph couldn't let that happen to land his family had protected for generations. Thomas absorbed this revelation with widening eyes, suddenly understanding the weight of responsibility his grandfather had placed upon his young shoulders. Is that why the company man seemed so interested in my rock? Jim nodded gravely, returning the stone to Thomas's small palm with surprising gentleness. They've suspected something valuable was hidden in these mountains for years, but could never pinpoint the location. Your grandfather was clever, registered the land as a wildlife conservation easement before he died, making it nearly impossible to develop without massive legal battles. That's why they're trying to buy you out now. The old miner's eyes crinkled with sudden warmth. Joseph always said his grandson had more spine than his son ever did. Said you understood what really matters in this world. He carefully refolded the map and returned it to Thomas. Those men won't stop easily, boy. The question now is whether you're ready to carry your grandfather's torch. That deposit stays safe, the mountain stays whole, but only if you hold your ground like he did. Thomas returned from old Jim's cabin to find his world upended once again. A familiar blue sedan parked in front of his grandfather's home and warm light spilling from windows that had been dark when he left. Hesitating at the forest's edge with Rex growling softly beside him, he watched shadows move across the curtains before squaring his small shoulders and approaching his own front door with the wariness of an intruder. Inside, the transformation was jarring. Uncle Paul stoking the fire while Aunt Meredith arranged store-bought cookies on grandfather's chipped plates. Cousins Derek and Samantha sprawled on the sofa as if they'd never left, their expensive winter jackets draped carelessly over the handmade furniture. There he is. Uncle Paul boomed with artificial cheer that didn't reach his calculating eyes. We've been worried sick, Thomas. Where have you been all day? Before Thomas could formulate a response, he found himself engulfed in Aunt Meredith's perfumed embrace, the unfamiliar affection stiffening his body like a threatened woodland creature. We've had a change of heart, she explained, smoothing his unruly hair with manicured fingernails that felt like claws against his scalp. Family should stick together, especially in winter. It wasn't right, leaving you here with just that neighbor woman checking in. Thomas extracted himself carefully, noting how his uncle's gaze swept methodically across the cabin's interior while maintaining his jovial facade. Eleanor takes good care of me, Thomas said quietly, fingers instinctively checking his pocket where the rock remained hidden. Relief washing through him that he'd tucked the map beneath a loose floorboard before leaving that morning. Uncle Paul's laugh sounded hollow in the cabin's confines. Still, a boy needs his family. We've decided to stay through winter, help sort out your grandfather's affairs properly. Cousin Derek, 2 years older and perpetually disdainful, rolled his eyes. Dad made us leave our phones behind for this dump. Says the reception is garbage anyway. Samantha nodded sullenly, but Thomas noticed her attention fixed on grandfather's old desk in the corner, its drawers still containing years of accumulated papers. Your grandfather must have left something behind, Uncle Paul said with practiced casualness as he handed Thomas a mug of hot chocolate that tasted nothing like Eleanor's homemade version. Deeds, insurance papers, maybe some maps of the property? The lawyer mentioned there might be additional documents we should review. The emphasis on maps sent a warning chill down Thomas's spine, especially when paired with the too interested gleam in his uncle's eyes. He didn't leave much. Thomas lied, remembering old Jim's warnings while avoiding his uncle's penetrating stare. Just some old books and tools. Aunt Meredith's smile tightened imperceptibly as she began unpacking bags of groceries. Well, we'll help you look through everything tomorrow. There might be important papers you've overlooked. That night, lying rigidly in his bed, with Rex standing vigilant guard beside him rather than in his usual sleeping spot, Thomas listened to the murmured adult conversations through the thin walls, conversations that occasionally included phrases like mineral rights and corporate interest when they thought him asleep. The family that had abandoned him over a worthless rock had returned with suspicious timing and transparent motives, just days after Hargrove's visit and his discovery of the map. Beneath his blanket, Thomas clutched the blue-veined stone tightly, its familiar warmth the only comfort in a home that suddenly felt more dangerous than the winter forest beyond his window. Pre-dawn darkness enveloped the cabin as Thomas carefully extracted himself from beneath his blankets, every muscle tense with the need for silence. The soft sounds of his uncle's snoring drifted from the main bedroom, while his cousins slept on pull-out mattresses in the living room, temporary barriers between Thomas and the night's mission. With practiced stealth born from months of solitary living, he navigated the familiar creaking floorboards with Rex padding silently beside him, faithful companion and co-conspirator. The dying embers in the fireplace cast just enough ruddy light to illuminate his path to the kitchen, where Thomas retrieved his grandfather's old magnifying glass from its drawer. Something had been nagging at his thoughts since old Jim's revelation about the rock, a half-remembered comment his grandfather had made during one of their nature walks. Nature reveals her secrets only to those who know how to look. With trembling fingers, Thomas extracted the blue-veined stone from his pajama pocket and knelt before the fireplace, his heart pounding with anticipation. As the rock's surface warmed in proximity to the glowing coals, an extraordinary transformation began to unfold before his widened eyes. Faint lines, previously invisible, began to emerge across the stone's surface like ghostly writing, forming what appeared to be numerical sequences and directional markings. Thomas stifled a gasp, hands shaking as he positioned the magnifying glass to better examine the phantom coordinates that seemed to correspond with markings on the hidden map. Thermochromic properties, he whispered to Rex, recalling a science lesson from Miss Carter about materials that change appearance with temperature variation. His grandfather, clever and forward-thinking as always, had encoded additional information into the very rock his family had dismissed as worthless. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the darkness behind him, sending a jolt of alarm through Thomas's small frame. Quickly pocketing both rock and magnifying glass, he feigned interest in stoking the fire as Aunt Meredith appeared in her silk robe, suspicion evident in her narrowed eyes. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked with artificial sweetness that did nothing to mask the sharpness of her gaze, scanning the room for anything out of place. Thomas nodded, mumbling about being thirsty, acutely aware of the warm rock pressing against his thigh through the thin fabric of his pajamas. After she retreated back to bed, Thomas remained motionless, his mind racing with implications of his discovery and the increasingly obvious connection between his family's sudden return and Hargrove's interest in the property. The coordinates hidden within the rock seemed to indicate a location different from the circled area on the map, perhaps a secondary site or alternative entrance to the mineral deposit. His grandfather had created an elegant failsafe, separating crucial pieces of information to prevent any single discovery from revealing the complete picture. Morning would bring renewed efforts from his family to locate any papers or maps, their manufactured affection a transparent veneer over their true purpose. Thomas felt the familiar ache of longing surge through his chest, the desperate wish that their return stemmed from genuine remorse rather than hidden agendas. How simple it would be to share his discovery, to bask in their approval and appreciation rather than bearing this burden alone. Yet as Rex pressed his warm body against Thomas's side, the boy stroked the loyal dog's fur and made his choice. The secret would remain his to protect, just as his grandfather had intended. Whatever lay hidden beneath the mountain was meant to be preserved, not exploited, and Thomas would honor that legacy even against the family whose acceptance he craved more than anything else in his young, complicated world. The winter sun had climbed halfway to its zenith when Thomas ventured out to replenish their dwindling firewood supply, an excuse to escape the suffocating presence of his relatives who had spent the morning systematically examining every corner of the cabin under the guise of cleaning up. Uncle Paul had repeatedly questioned Thomas about his grandfather's important papers, growing increasingly frustrated with the boy's insistence that no such documents existed. Relief washed over Thomas as he escaped into the crisp mountain air with Rex bounding joyfully ahead, the rock and his secret knowledge safely concealed in his inner jacket pocket, though he worried about the map still hidden beneath the loose floorboard under his bed. For over an hour, Thomas gathered fallen branches and split smaller logs with his grandfather's hatchet, the physical labor clearing his troubled mind while Rex patrolled the perimeter, occasionally raising his nose to test the wind. It was the dog's behavior that first alerted Thomas to trouble, the shepherd suddenly abandoning his playful demeanor, ears flattening as he sprinted back toward the cabin with urgent purpose. Thomas dropped his armload of wood and raced after the animal, dread building with each labored breath that clouded before him in the winter air. The cabin door stood ajar, swinging slightly in the mountain breeze, a sight that sent ice through Thomas's veins that had nothing to do with the surrounding snow. Inside, chaos greeted him. Familiar order transformed into disarray. Drawers emptied onto floors, furniture upended, even the old photograph albums torn apart with pictures scattered like autumn leaves across the wooden planks. Grandfather's room. Thomas whispered, heart pounding as he navigated the destruction toward his bedroom, where the loose floorboard had concealed the precious map. His fears materialized into crushing certainty when he discovered the floorboard pried completely away, the small cavity beneath empty of its treasure. A strangled sound escaped his throat, drawing Rex to press reassuringly against his leg as tears threatened to blur his vision. The shepherd nudged his hand insistently, then trotted to the back door, which also stood partially open, looking back expectantly at his young master. Outside, fresh footprints led away from the cabin, not toward the main road but cutting across the property toward an overgrown hunting path rarely used since his grandfather had designated the land as a wildlife sanctuary. Thomas knelt to examine the prints, noting their depth and distinct tread pattern, certainly not made by his uncle's city loafers or his cousin's fashion boots. The sound of a vehicle approaching drew him back to the front of the cabin just as his uncle's sedan pulled up, Aunt Meredith and the cousins returning from their purported trip to the village store for supplies. Uncle Paul's performance of shock and outrage would have been convincing to anyone who hadn't seen the calculated gleam in his eyes as he surveyed the disarray, his practiced concern as he checked if anything valuable had been taken. "Must be local thieves," he declared with authority, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder that felt like a leaden weight. "These remote cabins are easy targets. I told your grandfather to install better locks years ago." Thomas nodded mutely, noting how his uncle's gaze lingered on the exposed hiding place beneath the floorboard, how his questions focused on whether Thomas had found any papers or maps among his grandfather's possessions. Outside, Rex remained fixated on the hunting trail, occasionally whining softly as if urging Thomas to follow before the snow covered whatever truth lay at the end of those solitary footprints. Monday morning arrived with brutal clarity, the weekend's events leaving Thomas exhausted yet determined as he boarded the yellow school bus that navigated the treacherous mountain roads with practiced ease. The familiar routine of school offered a strange comfort after the tension at home, where his uncle maintained the charade of familial concern while systematically searching the property under various pretexts. Thomas had kept the rock with him constantly, sleeping with it beneath his pillow and carrying it in his pocket like a talisman, its warmth a reminder of his grandfather's trust in him alone. During lunch period, Thomas slipped away to the school library, claiming a corner desk partially hidden by towering shelves where he could work undisturbed. The geology reference books yielded little information about the specific blue-veined mineral old Jim had identified, but Thomas meticulously recorded what he could find about rare earth elements and their applications in modern technology. His concentration was so complete that he failed to notice Miss Carter observing his research until she spoke, her voice gentle yet curious as she examined his careful notes. "That looks more advanced than our regular science curriculum, Thomas. Working on something special?" He hesitated before offering the carefully constructed half-truth he had rehearsed, a special project about local geology to honor his grandfather's interest in the mountain's composition. Miss Carter's expression shifted subtly at the mention of Joseph Miller, recognition flickering across her features as she settled into the chair beside him. "I knew your grandfather, actually," she revealed, her voice lowering to a confidential tone that immediately captured Thomas's full attention. "Before I started teaching, I worked with the Mountain Heritage Conservation Alliance. Your grandfather was one of our most dedicated supporters when Alpine Peak Resources first attempted to establish mining operations in this range about 15 years ago." Thomas's heart quickened as connections began forming in his mind, the teacher continuing without prompting. Joseph Miller provided crucial evidence about the ecological impact their proposed methods would have on the watershed. The case went all the way to the state Supreme Court, where we eventually won protection status for most of the range. Her eyes grew distant with memory before refocusing on Thomas with newfound interest. He was particularly concerned about the North Face, though I never understood why that area specifically mattered more than others. Thomas fought to maintain a neutral expression despite the excitement coursing through him at this confirmation of his grandfather's environmental motivations. Miss Carter glanced at his notebook, her eyebrows rising slightly at his detailed drawings of mineral compositions. "If you're interested in local geology, I have some resources from my conservation days that might help with your project." including environmental impact studies Alpine Peak tried to suppress. The final bell prevented further conversation, but Miss Carter wrote a note excusing Thomas's slight tardiness to his next class, adding her home phone number at the bottom with instructions to call if he wanted to borrow those materials. Throughout the afternoon, Thomas processed this unexpected alliance, carefully considering how much to reveal to the teacher who had known his grandfather as a fellow environmental defender. The coincidence seemed too perfect, yet his grandfather had always emphasized that true coincidences were rare in matters of importance. As Thomas boarded the afternoon bus, the rock secure in his pocket, and Miss Carter's phone number folded in his notebook, he felt the first stirrings of a plan forming in his mind, one that would require adult allies beyond old Jim and Eleanor, if he hoped to protect whatever secret lay beneath the mountain that both his family and Alpine Peak Resources seemed desperate to exploit. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold as Thomas made his way to Miss Carter's modest home on the outskirts of town, having convinced his uncle that he needed to work on a school project. The teacher welcomed him with a warm smile that contrasted sharply with the forced affection he had endured from his relatives all week. Her living room had been transformed into an impromptu research center. Cardboard boxes labeled Miller Case stacked beside her coffee table, and manila folders spread across every available surface. "I kept everything after the case concluded, Miss," Carter explained, gesturing Thomas toward a chair as she poured hot chocolate into mismatched mugs. "Your grandfather was instrumental in our legal victory, so I archived all the documentation." For the next hour, Thomas immersed himself in a history he had never known. Yellowed newspaper clippings and legal briefs revealing his grandfather as not merely a reclusive mountain man, but a determined environmental defender who had meticulously documented Alpine Peak's previous attempts to exploit the mountain range. Miss Carter pointed to a particularly significant court transcript, her finger underlining a familiar name. Richard Hargrove was already a senior executive back then, though not yet CEO. He personally testified about the company's commitment to environmental protection, promises that our evidence proved were completely disingenuous. Thomas studied a faded photograph, showing his grandfather standing before the courthouse beside a younger Miss Carter, his weathered face solemn yet determined. Alpine Peak never forgave your grandfather for blocking what would have been their most profitable venture to date. She continued, passing Thomas a thick folder containing property assessment records. They attempted to purchase surrounding properties. Offered your grandfather sums that would have made him wealthy beyond imagination, but he refused every offer. Thomas felt a growing sense of clarity as puzzle pieces clicked into place, his small fingers carefully turning pages of correspondence that documented increasingly aggressive acquisition attempts. Then he found something that made his blood run cold, a letter dated just 2 months before his grandfather's death, threatening legal action against Joseph Miller for alleged violations of mineral rights agreements. The letterhead displayed Alpine Peak Resources, but the signature at the bottom belonged to Thomas's own uncle, Paul Miller, listed as legal consultant. "Your uncle worked for them?" Miss Carter asked, noting Thomas's stunned expression as she glanced at the document. "I had no idea there was a family connection to the corporation." Thomas could barely form words as the betrayal crystallized in his mind. Memories of his uncle's increasingly frequent visits in the months before his grandfather's death suddenly taking on sinister significance. "They abandoned me right after the funeral," Thomas whispered, connecting final dots in a picture too painful to fully comprehend. "Uncle Paul said grandfather had wasted his life protecting worthless land when we could have been rich." Miss Carter's expression softened with understanding as she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "The timing makes sense now. Alpine Peak must have approached them again after your grandfather passed, hoping the family would be more amenable to selling." She hesitated before continuing, choosing her words carefully. "Your uncle's return, especially if he's still connected to the company, suggests they're making another attempt to acquire the land. The question is, why now after all these years? What's changed to make them so persistent?" Thomas's hand instinctively sought the rock in his pocket, its secret markings and rare mineral composition representing value beyond what even Miss Carter realized. The corporation's renewed interest, his family's sudden betrayal and equally sudden return, the stolen map, all revolved around whatever treasure his grandfather had discovered and chosen to protect even at the cost of his own family's understanding. Evening shadows lengthened across the cabin floor as Thomas stood in the doorway, a folded photocopy of his uncle's signature on Alpine Peak letterhead clutched in his trembling hand. Uncle Paul sat alone at the kitchen table, reviewing documents spread before him, his reading glasses perched on his nose and coffee mug steaming beside stacks of papers that looked suspiciously like property assessments. Thomas had waited until Aunt Meredith took his cousins to town for supplies, knowing this confrontation required privacy, with only Rex standing faithfully by his side. "You work for them," Thomas stated flatly, his voice steadier than his racing heart as he stepped fully into the room. His uncle looked up sharply, confusion quickly replaced by wariness, as Thomas approached the table and placed the photocopied letter between them. "You work for Alpine Peak." "You have for years." Uncle Paul removed his glasses slowly, his expression cycling through surprise, anger, and finally a calculating assessment as he considered his nephew's unwavering gaze. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, fingertips pressing against the incriminating document. "Miss Carter kept records from grandfather's legal battle." Thomas replied, watching his uncle's face pale slightly. "She showed me everything, including how you started consulting for them right after graduating law school. You were working against your own father." Uncle Paul's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath the skin as he pushed back from the table. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Adult matters are more complicated than a child could understand." Thomas stood his ground even as his uncle rose to his full height, attempting to intimidate with his superior size. "I understand betrayal," Thomas countered, fingers curling around the rock in his pocket. "I understand you abandoned me after grandfather died because I wouldn't let you sell his land. And now you're back because the company sent you, not because you actually care about me." Something crumbled in his uncle's expression, the practiced facade giving way to a truth he seemed almost relieved to finally speak aloud. "The property is worth millions, Thomas. Millions. Your grandfather was a selfish old fool who denied his family security because of some misguided environmental crusade." He raked fingers through his thinning hair in frustration. "Yes, Alpine Peak approached us after the funeral. They offered a generous finder's fee if we could convince you to sell, more money than you could imagine. When you refused to part with that stupid rock, we figured you were just as stubborn as him." His voice softened, becoming almost pleading. "But it doesn't have to be this way. The company has made an even better offer. We could all benefit, have the life we deserve instead of clinging to this dilapidated cabin and worthless mountain." The familiar ache of longing twisted in Thomas's chest even as anger burned through his veins, the desperate wish for family warring with the knowledge of their fundamental betrayal. "Grandfather said the land was priceless, that some things matter more than money," Thomas whispered, backing toward the door with Rex pressing protectively against his leg. "He was right about the mountain, and he was right about you." Uncle Paul's expression hardened, calculation replacing conciliation. "You found something, didn't you? That's why you're suddenly so interested in geology. What was in that map, Thomas? What did the old man tell you before he died?" Without answering, Thomas turned and bolted through the door, Rex racing beside him as they plunged into the familiar embrace of the forest. Behind him, his uncle's shouts faded as Thomas ran deeper into the trees, tears streaming down his face, the rock his only possession as he fled from the painful truth of his family's greed and his own shattered hopes for reconciliation. Thomas had no destination in mind as he fled through the darkening forest, his only thought to put distance between himself and the painful truth of his uncle's betrayal. The temperature dropped rapidly as afternoon surrendered to evening, the mountain weather notorious for its swift and merciless changes. The first snowflakes began falling innocently enough, gentle crystalline visitors that gradually multiplied into an advancing army of white. Within minutes, the gentle snowfall transformed into a howling blizzard that obliterated familiar landmarks and reduced visibility to mere feet. Wind-driven ice particles stung Thomas's exposed skin as he struggled forward, one arm raised to shield his eyes while the other gripped Rex's collar, the shepherd now serving as both companion and guide through the worsening conditions. Disorientation set in quickly, the blinding curtain of white erasing any sense of direction until Thomas realized with growing panic that he had no idea which way led home or how far he had ventured into the wilderness. Rex barked suddenly, tugging insistently toward a dark shape barely visible through the swirling snow, a rocky outcropping that promised at least minimal shelter from the storm's fury. Thomas followed gratefully, his numbed legs struggling through deepening drifts until they reached the narrow opening of a small cave carved into the mountainside. Inside, the howling wind receded to a mournful moan, allowing Thomas to catch his breath and assess their situation with growing concern. Night had fallen completely, the temperature plummeting to dangerous levels, and the storm showed no signs of abating. Using the small flashlight he always carried in his jacket, Thomas examined their shelter, the beam revealing a shallow cavity barely large enough for boy and dog. As he swept the light across the cave walls, distinctive rock formations caught his attention, vertical striations of dark and light stone that looked strikingly familiar. With trembling hands, Thomas withdrew the photograph from his inner pocket, the one from the metal box showing his grandfather and the unknown man standing at a cave entrance. Even in the dim flashlight beam, the similarity between the striations in the photo and those before him now was unmistakable, the realization sending a surge of excitement through his chilled body. This had to be the same location, or perhaps another entrance to whatever system of caves his grandfather had explored. As if sensing the discovery's importance, Rex began pawing excitedly at the cave's rear wall, his claws scraping against what appeared to be loose gravel and dirt. Despite the cold seeping into his bones, Thomas joined the dog's efforts, clearing debris from the area until his fingers encountered something unexpected, not the natural resistance of solid rock, but what felt like carefully positioned stones. Together, boy and dog worked with renewed purpose, Rex digging with powerful paws while Thomas pulled away loosened material, the growing pile behind them testimony to their determined excavation. After what seemed like hours, a gust of warmer air against his frozen face made Thomas pause in surprise, directing his flashlight into the expanding gap to reveal not a solid wall, but a narrow passage extending deeper into the mountain. The hidden entrance had been deliberately concealed, the natural appearance of the barrier masking human intervention designed to keep casual visitors from discovering whatever lay beyond. With the blizzard intensifying outside and the temperature dropping to life-threatening levels, Thomas realized they had no choice but to venture forward into the unknown depths. The passage beckoning with both mystery and the promise of shelter, a secret his grandfather had guarded and that his uncle would destroy for profit. Thomas crawled through the narrow passage on hands and knees, following Rex, whose keen senses navigated the darkness with greater confidence than the wavering beam of the small flashlight. The tunnel extended deep into the mountain, occasionally widening enough for Thomas to stand before constricting again, the rough stone walls bearing signs of both natural formation and human modification. After nearly 30 minutes of cautious progress, the passage abruptly opened into a space so vast that his flashlight beam disappeared into darkness, unable to find the opposite wall or ceiling. The sudden transition from confinement to expansiveness momentarily disoriented Thomas, until his eyes adjusted and the true nature of the chamber revealed itself in breathtaking clarity. The walls surrounding him glittered with veins of blue mineral, identical to those in his rock, but here they formed intricate patterns that ran throughout the cavern like luminous rivers frozen in stone, reflecting his flashlight beam and multiplying its effectiveness. The temperature here was notably warmer than outside, the air carrying a strange metallic tang that tingled in his nostrils with each breath. As Thomas moved deeper into the cavern, his light revealed evidence of human presence. A small camp area with an old kerosene lantern, pickaxes and geological hammers arranged neatly on a folding table, collection bags labeled with dates spanning several years, and most remarkably, a wooden chair pulled up to a small desk where a leather-bound journal lay open, as if its writer had just stepped away momentarily. Thomas approached reverently, recognizing his grandfather's possessions, noting how the collection site had been meticulously maintained and organized, no detail overlooked. The journal's pages contained his grandfather's distinctive handwriting, entries dating back 15 years and continuing until just weeks before his death, documenting the discovery and analysis of what he termed Blue Vein NST, with detailed illustrations of its crystalline structure and notes on its unusual properties. Thomas settled into the chair that still held the impression of his grandfather's form, Rex lying contentedly at his feet as if sensing they had reached their destination, and began reading the most recent entries with growing fascination. His grandfather described identifying the unique mineral composition after a minor landslide revealed a previously concealed section of the north face, recognizing immediately its potential value to technology companies developing specialized components for communications and defense systems. The journal detailed his research process, consultations with trusted geologist friends who confirmed the substance was potentially worth billions, and most importantly, his moral reasoning for keeping the discovery secret. The extraction methods currently available would devastate the entire watershed. One passage explained, conventional mining would require removing the entire mountainside, contaminating groundwater for decades, destroying ancient forest and displacing all wildlife from the valley. The mineral's value is undeniable, but the cost of extraction using today's methods is simply too high. I choose to protect this discovery until technology advances enough to allow responsible extraction, even if that time comes long after I am gone. The final entry, dated just days before his death, contained instructions clearly meant for Thomas. If you are reading this, then you have found both the rock and this chamber. Trust your instincts, grandson. This discovery represents power beyond monetary value, power that corrupts those who seek only profit. The decision now passes to you, as does the responsibility to protect this mountain until the world is ready to extract its treasures without destruction. Thomas remained transfixed in his grandfather's chair for hours, methodically working through the journal entries that revealed a comprehensive scientific and ethical chronicle spanning more than a decade. The earlier pages contained detailed analyses of the blue-veined mineral, which his grandfather had sent discreetly to university laboratories under false pretenses to avoid attracting corporate attention. The results confirmed his initial suspicions. The substance contained an unprecedented concentration of neodymium scandium tantalum, with a unique crystalline structure that enhanced its conductive properties beyond anything currently available in commercial applications. According to one metallurgist whose confidential correspondence was carefully preserved between journal pages, the mineral could revolutionize everything from communications technology to medical devices, aerospace components to quantum computing. A single ton of refined material could be worth more than $50 million to the right buyers, with the cavern containing an estimated 800 tons of extractable ore. What followed these technical assessments was a meticulous environmental impact study his grandfather had conducted independently, documenting the mountain's complex ecosystem with photographs, wildlife migration patterns, watershed maps, and seasonal variations in biodiversity. His notes revealed that conventional mining operations would require removing approximately 70% of the north face, diverting 3 underground streams that fed the valley's main river, and introducing chemical extraction processes that would leave toxic residue for generations. The journal detailed his grandfather's internal struggle, weighing immense potential wealth against environmental devastation, ultimately concluding that no amount of money justified destroying a natural system that had evolved over millions of years. I could provide financial security for 10 generations of millers. One particularly poignant entry read, but at the cost of clean water, breathable air, and natural beauty for 100 generations of valley residents, human and animal alike. Instead of exploitation, his grandfather had chosen documentation, creating a comprehensive record of the deposit, its composition, and potential applications, sealed in waterproof containers and hidden throughout the cavern system. Thomas found references to topographic surveys, chemical analyses, and extraction feasibility studies, all preserved for a future when technological advancement might allow responsible harvesting without ecological destruction. The final sections revealed his grandfather's growing awareness of Alpine Peak's interest in the region, their geological surveys coming dangerously close to discovering the deposit, and his legal maneuvers to secure environmental protections for the land. Most shocking were transcribed conversations with Thomas's Uncle Paul, initially brought into his confidence as a newly minted environmental lawyer, who had subsequently betrayed that trust by approaching Alpine Peak with vague hints about the property's potential value. The last entry, written in a shakier hand that betrayed his grandfather's failing health, expressed both disappointment in his son's moral compromise and unwavering faith in his grandson's character. Thomas understands what truly matters. He sees value in a perfect spider's web heavy with morning dew, in the silent passage of deer through ancient forest, in the interdependent dance of all living things. The rock I will leave him serves as both key and test. If he values it despite its ordinary appearance, he will eventually find his way here, to the truth. The mountain has chosen him as its next guardian, just as it once chose me. The blizzard transformed into one of the worst storms in recent memory, howling winds driving snow into impenetrable drifts that quickly obscured any trace of Thomas's path into the forest. At the cabin, Uncle Paul's initial anger had given way to genuine concern as evening deepened into night with no sign of his nephew, finally prompting a call to the local ranger station to report a missing child. The small mountain community mobilized with practiced efficiency, volunteers gathering at the community hall where search grids were assigned and emergency supplies distributed. Eleanor arrived bundled against the cold, her weathered face set with determination as she confronted Paul with undisguised suspicion. "What did you say to that boy to drive him into a blizzard?" she demanded, old Jim appearing beside her with snowshoes in hand and decades of mountain knowledge evident in his prepared pack. Thomas's uncle attempted explanations that sounded hollow even to his own ears as the volunteer coordinator interrupted with assignments, pairing Eleanor and Jim together due to their intimate knowledge of Joseph Miller's property. Hours into the search, with conditions deteriorating beyond safety protocols, most teams had been recalled to base, but Eleanor and Jim pressed on, following what old Jim claimed was an intuitive understanding of where a frightened boy might seek shelter. Their persistence led them near the rocky outcropping where Rex, sensing their approach, began barking with such insistent volume that the sound penetrated even the storm's fury, guiding the searchers to the cave entrance partly obscured by drifting snow. "Thomas." Eleanor called, her voice carrying the mixture of relief and lingering worry unique to those who truly care. "We've been looking everywhere for you." The narrow passage initially gave her pause until old Jim demonstrated that even his broader frame could navigate the tight space, leading the way with his powerful flashlight illuminating their path to the remarkable chamber beyond. Thomas looked up from his grandfather's journal with surprise that quickly transformed into relief at the sight of the two people he trusted most, their arrival seeming almost predestined given what he had just learned. Old Jim's expression of wonder as he surveyed the mineral-veined walls confirmed the magnitude of Thomas's discovery. "Your grandfather showed me samples," he admitted, "but never brought me to the source. Said fewer people knowing meant fewer chances of the secret getting out." Eleanor's practical nature asserted itself as she assessed their situation. The satellite phone she carried reporting no signal this deep within the mountain and the storm above showing no signs of abating. "We're not going anywhere tonight," she announced, emptying her pack of emergency provisions and activating chemical heat packs to supplement the ambient warmth of the cavern. As they settled into an impromptu camp, Thomas shared what he had learned from the journal, watching understanding dawn on their faces as his grandfather's years of secretive behavior suddenly made perfect sense. "Joseph always played the long game," old Jim nodded, examining a mineral sample with expert appreciation. "He knew someday technology would advance enough to make extraction possible without destroying everything else." Eleanor wrapped a thermal blanket around Thomas's shoulders, her expression softening as she regarded the boy's exhausted but determined face. "Your grandfather chose the right successor," she said simply, the quiet confidence in her voice providing a comfort more warming than any blanket as the storm raged impotently above their protected sanctuary. The small camp within the glittering cavern took on an almost mystical quality as old Jim lit his emergency lantern, the flame casting dancing shadows across the mineral-veined walls, while Eleanor prepared a simple meal from their combined provisions. The atmosphere grew contemplative as weariness settled into their bones, prompting stories that flowed like the underground streams coursing invisibly through the mountain around them. "Your grandfather turned down $14 million from Alpine Peak," old Jim revealed, his gravelly voice filled with admiration. "Cash in hand, no questions asked. Just sign the property over and walk away wealthy. He showed me the letter, laughed about it while we fished Copper Creek." Eleanor nodded, passing Thomas a steaming mug of broth that warmed his hands and spirit equally. "Joseph understood wealth differently than most," she continued, gesturing to the glittering cavern surrounding them. "He measured it in clean water, thriving wildlife, ancient trees, and knowing his grandchild could experience the mountain as nature intended, not as a hollowed-out corporate extraction site." The night deepened as they shared stories Thomas had never heard, painting a portrait of his grandfather more complete than he had known. A man who had fought corporate interests not from blind environmental idealism, but from a deeply practical understanding of generational responsibility. "The company men never understood," old Jim explained, examining the journal with careful hands. "They saw only the next quarterly profit, while your grandfather saw centuries ahead. He knew technology would eventually advance enough to extract these minerals without destroying everything else, but he refused to sacrifice the mountain for immediate gain." Thomas listened in silent contemplation, understanding more clearly the weight of responsibility that had passed to him through the simple act of inheriting a seemingly worthless rock. The mineral deposit represented billions in potential wealth, enough to transform his life and secure his family's financial future for generations. Yet extracting it now would fulfill his grandfather's darkest fears. He believed some decisions belonged not to individuals but to the land itself, Eleanor said softly, her weathered hand covering Thomas's smaller one with gentle pressure. He used to say that we don't truly own the mountain, we merely borrow it from our great-grandchildren. Mourning would bring decisions that seemed impossibly complex for a 10-year-old boy. Determining whether to reveal the deposit's location to authorities who might protect it, or risk the information falling into corporate hands that would exploit it regardless of environmental cost. Thomas thought of his uncle, wondering if knowledge of the deposit's true scale might reawaken whatever environmental principles had once guided him before corporate influence corrupted his perspective. He thought of his cousins and the life they could have if the minerals were responsibly extracted, balanced against the certainty that current methods would destroy the ecosystem his grandfather had dedicated his life to protecting. The journal entries made his grandfather's wishes clear, but they also emphasized that the final choice now belonged to Thomas, the next guardian selected not by default but by demonstrated character. As Rex settled against him with comforting warmth, Thomas realized that his grandfather had prepared him for precisely this moment through years of mountain lessons, teaching him to value what truly mattered beyond monetary measurement, entrusting him with a legacy far more significant than mere inheritance. Morning arrived with brilliant clarity, the storm having exhausted its fury overnight and leaving behind a pristine landscape transformed by fresh snow that sparkled blindingly in the sunlight. Thomas, Eleanor, and old Jim emerged cautiously from the hidden passage, carefully concealing the entrance behind them before making their way down the mountainside toward the main trail where they expected to encounter search teams still looking for them. What they found instead sent ice through Thomas's veins despite the warming day, a scene that seemed orchestrated for maximum pressure. His uncle, aunt, and cousin standing in a tight group beside several official-looking vehicles, while Richard Hargrove and two suited men waited nearby with barely concealed impatience. Rex growled softly beside Thomas, who instinctively placed his hand on the dog's head to quiet him while processing the tableau before him. Uncle Paul spotted them first, genuine relief washing over his face as he rushed forward through the snow, followed closely by Aunt Meredith, whose reddened eyes suggested actual tears had been shed over his disappearance. "Thomas, thank God," his uncle breathed, reaching out before hesitating at the boy's wary expression. "We were terrified something had happened to you." Before Thomas could respond, Hargrove approached with calculated concern, his corporate smile firmly in place though his eyes remained coldly analytical. "Quite an adventure, young man. The entire community has been searching for you." His gaze shifted briefly to Eleanor and old Jim, a flash of suspicion crossing his features. "How fortunate these two found you before the temperature dropped further." The rock in Thomas's pocket seemed to grow impossibly heavy, its weight a constant reminder of the decision he now faced with both sides watching expectantly. Uncle Paul knelt in the snow before him, an unprecedented gesture from a man who had always maintained an air of superiority. "I need to apologize, Thomas. What I said yesterday, about your grandfather, about the land, it was wrong. Family should come before everything else, and we should have respected Joseph's wishes, and yours." The sincerity in his voice sounded genuine, but Thomas noticed how his uncle's eyes darted occasionally toward Hargrove, suggesting competing loyalties still at war within him. Aunt Meredith joined the attempted reconciliation, adding her own tearful apologies while his cousins remained silent but seemingly chastened in the background. Hargrove interrupted their family moment with practiced smoothness, producing documents from his leather portfolio. "While this reunion is touching, there are pressing matters requiring attention. During the search, our geological survey team detected significant anomalies in the north face that warrant immediate investigation under mineral rights statutes." His tone hardened slightly as he continued. "As Alpine Peak's CEO, I am prepared to offer substantial compensation to the Miller family for expedited access. But I must caution that corporate interests occasionally supersede individual property rights when strategic resources are concerned." The veiled threat hung in the cold air between them, Eleanor's hand finding Thomas's shoulder in silent support, while old Jim stepped forward with the protective stance of someone who had confronted corporate bullies before. Thomas felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing upon him from all sides, each adult projecting their own desires and fears onto a child suddenly thrust into a position of extraordinary responsibility. His cousins watched with newfound curiosity, perhaps seeing him differently after his night of survival in the wilderness. A forest ranger stood nearby, clipboard in hand, clearly torn between concluding a successful rescue operation and addressing the tension unfolding before him. Thomas's fingers closed around the rock in his pocket, its familiar contours somehow comforting despite representing the burden his grandfather had placed upon him. In that moment, with snow melting beneath their boots and morning sunlight illuminating faces both familiar and foreign, Thomas realized that whatever choice he made would irreversibly alter not only his future, but the mountain's destiny for generations to come. The decision that had seemed theoretical in the safety of the hidden cavern now demanded immediate resolution, with Thomas standing at the center of forces far more powerful than any 10-year-old should have to face. The rock in his pocket a physical manifestation of the burden his grandfather had entrusted to him alone. The tension surrounding the small gathering on the snowy mountainside grew palpable as Thomas processed the competing pressures bearing down upon him. His family watched with expressions ranging from hopeful to calculating, while Hargrove projected confident expectation tempered with barely concealed impatience. Thomas felt Eleanor and old Jim standing like twin bulwarks behind him, their quiet strength bolstering his resolve as he formulated a response that honored both his grandfather's vision and the practical realities of the situation before him. Drawing a deep breath of crisp mountain air, Thomas spoke with a clarity that belied his years. "Mr. Hargrove, my grandfather discovered something valuable in these mountains long ago, something he chose to protect rather than exploit, because he understood that some treasures are worth more than money." He paused, gauging the CEO's reaction, noting how Hargrove's eyes narrowed with intensified interest. "I know where the Blue Vein mineral deposit is located, and I understand its value to your company and to technology development." Hargrove stepped forward, barely containing his eagerness. "Then you recognize the practical benefits of allowing Alpine Peak to extract these resources. We can ensure your financial security for life, young man." Thomas shook his head slowly, continuing with measured words. "My grandfather documented everything about the deposit, including why conventional mining methods would devastate this entire ecosystem. He believed the mountain should remain untouched until technology could extract the minerals without destruction." A calculating smile spread across Hargrove's face. "Technology has advanced significantly in recent years. Perhaps we could find methods your grandfather couldn't have anticipated." "I have a proposal," Thomas stated firmly, standing straighter as he delivered terms that had crystallized during his night in the hidden cavern. "I will provide complete access to my grandfather's documentation and the deposit location under specific conditions. First, Alpine Peak must develop and implement truly sustainable extraction methods that preserve the watershed and forest ecosystem. Second, 50% of all profits must fund a permanent wildlife preserve covering the surrounding 10,000 acres. Third, independent environmental monitors must have unrestricted oversight of all operations with authority to halt work if violations occur." The audacity of a child proposing terms to a corporate giant momentarily stunned the Flast, gathering into silence before Hargrove recovered with a dismissive wave. "Such restrictions would make extraction economically unfeasible. Our shareholders would never approve such terms." Old Jim stepped forward, his weathered face set with determination. "Conventional mining would face years of environmental litigation, Richard. Joseph Miller documented everything, prepared evidence for court battles that would tie you up for a decade. The boy is offering a reasonable alternative," Eleanor added quietly, "and the documentation is secure in locations only Thomas knows. Without his cooperation, finding the primary deposit could take years, if ever." Thomas watched conflict play across Hargrove's features, corporate instinct warring with practical reality, before the CEO's expression settled into reluctant calculation. Such an arrangement would require extensive legal framework, environmental impact studies, technological research, all of which my grandfather already completed, Thomas replied, confidence growing with each word. "The journals contain everything your scientists would need to develop appropriate extraction methods." After tense negotiation during which Thomas remained steadfast despite his uncle's attempts to suggest more favorable terms for Alpine Peak, Hargrove finally extended his hand with the practiced smile of someone unaccustomed to compromise. "We have a preliminary agreement, young man. My legal team will draft appropriate documents for all parties to review." As they walked toward the waiting vehicles, Thomas felt no triumph in Hargrove's reluctant acquiescence, only cautious hope tempered by his grandfather's warnings about corporate promises. The rock rested lighter in his pocket now that its secret had been partially revealed, but Thomas remained vigilant, understanding that agreements made in snow could melt with the coming thaw if not carefully preserved through continued vigilance. 2 weeks had passed since the tentative agreement, weeks filled with meetings between lawyers, environmental consultants, and corporate representatives during which Thomas had cautiously shared selected portions of his grandfather's research while withholding the exact location of the main deposit. The preliminary agreement seemed to be proceeding with surprising smoothness, with Uncle Paul leveraging his legal expertise to ensure the conservation provisions remained intact, and Hargrove's team making encouraging noises about sustainable extraction methods under development in their research division. Thomas had begun to nurture cautious hope that his compromise might actually succeed in honoring both his grandfather's environmental principles and the practical reality of eventually extracting the valuable minerals. This fragile optimism shattered on a crisp Saturday morning when Thomas and Rex embarked on their weekly hike to refresh trail markers along the eastern ridge, a conservation project his grandfather had maintained for decades. Their familiar route took them past a densely forested area that opened onto a panoramic viewpoint of the North Face, a spot where Thomas had often sat with his grandfather to appreciate the untouched beauty of the mountain landscape. What greeted him instead sent shockwaves of betrayal through his small frame. Heavy machinery carving brutal access roads into the previously pristine slope, portable buildings established at the base of operations, and worst of all, a drilling platform positioned precisely where the stolen map would have indicated a secondary mineral deposit. From his elevated vantage point, Thomas could see the environmental devastation unfolding with merciless efficiency. Trees bulldozed into haphazard piles, a stream already running cloudy with sediment, and most heartbreaking, a family of deer picking their way in confused terror through the destruction of their habitat. Rex growled beside him, the shepherd's instincts detecting the wrongness of the scene below even without human understanding of broken promises. With trembling fingers, Thomas retrieved the satellite phone. Eleanor had insisted he carry on his excursions, his voice cracking with emotion as he reported what he was witnessing. Her promised response was immediate, but Thomas knew that even rapid intervention would come too late for the damage already inflicted. Making his way carefully down a game trail that would bring him closer without exposing his presence, Thomas documented the operation with his grandfather's old camera, capturing images of equipment bearing Alpine Peak logos, workers without environmental protection gear handling materials that his grandfather's journal had explicitly identified as potentially toxic to the watershed, and most damning, Richard Hargrove himself surveying the operation with triumphant satisfaction from the hood of a company vehicle. The betrayal cut deeper than Thomas had imagined possible. The realization that Hargrove had merely been placating him with false negotiations, while simultaneously moving forward with exactly the type of destructive extraction his grandfather had fought against for decades. The duplicity extended beyond mere corporate greed, representing a fundamental breach of the tentative trust Thomas had extended during their negotiation on the mountainside. Most concerning was the location itself, which indicated Hargrove had not only acted on information from the stolen map, but had targeted a particularly sensitive area that his grandfather's journal had explicitly warned contained underground water channels feeding the Tenge Valley's primary aquifer, an area where contamination would spread rapidly throughout the entire watershed, poisoning wildlife and potentially human water supplies for miles downstream. Thomas observed with growing horror the careless handling of drilling waste, thick sludge pooling dangerously close to a seasonal creek bed that would channel the toxic runoff directly into the valley's water system with the first significant rainfall. Workers moved with the efficiency of those under pressure to produce results quickly, sacrificing safety protocols that Thomas recognized from his grandfather's meticulous notes on proper mineral extraction procedures. A flock of startled birds took flight from a nearby stand of trees as a loud explosion signaled another round of invasive testing, the percussion echoing across the valley like a declaration of war against the mountain itself. Thomas felt a surge of fierce protectiveness rise within him, grief transforming into determination as he continued documenting the violations with steady hands despite his racing heart. His grandfather had predicted this very scenario, had prepared for corporate deception with contingency plans detailed in the final pages of his journal. The broken promises before him confirmed what Joseph Miller had understood all along, that some corporate interests would never prioritize environmental protection over profit. Regardless of agreements signed or promises made, Thomas knew with sudden clarity that the time for compromise had passed, that his grandfather's more aggressive legal and publicity contingency plans would now need to be implemented with urgency before irreversible damage spread beyond this initial incursion. News of Alpine Peak's illegal operations spread through the mountain community with the speed and force of a forest fire, fueled by Thomas's photographic evidence and the respected testimonies of Eleanor and old Jim. Miss Carter transformed her classroom after hours into an impromptu command center, her conservation background proving invaluable as she helped Thomas compile documentation of permit violations, unauthorized land use, and environmental regulations being flagrantly ignored by Hargrove's operation. Community members filled the small space each evening, lifelong residents alongside newer arrivals, all united by shared outrage at the corporate invasion of their mountain. "My grandfather always said the land belongs to everyone who loves it," Thomas explained during one particularly crowded meeting, his small voice growing stronger with each word as neighbors nodded in solemn agreement. He believed one person standing alone might falter, but a community standing together cannot be ignored. Eleanor contributed her extensive network of contacts from environmental organizations across the state, coordinating their involvement with practiced efficiency that belied her advanced age. Most surprising was Miss Carter's discovery in the school archives, a dusty VHS tape containing local news coverage of protests from 15 years prior, footage showing Joseph Miller standing before a similar group of concerned citizens, his impassioned speech about protecting the mountain for future generations, echoing his grandson's words with uncanny similarity. Watching the grainy footage projected on the classroom wall, Thomas felt a profound connection to his grandfather, understanding more deeply the legacy he had inherited, one measured not in mineral wealth but in moral conviction. The community response exceeded everyone's expectations, with over 200 protesters gathering at dawn to form a human blockade, preventing further equipment from reaching the illegal mining site. Local media arrived to cover the standoff, cameras capturing the stark contrast between peaceful citizens holding handmade signs and the aggressive security personnel Hargrove had stationed at the property line. Thomas stood at the front of the gathering, Rex vigilant beside him, as he delivered a statement that combined his grandfather's environmental wisdom with his own simple, powerful truth. "This mountain nourishes all life in our valley. Its waters flow through every home. Its forests clean the air we breathe. Its beauty fills our spirits. Some treasures cannot be measured in dollars." Most unexpected was the gradual transformation in Thomas's family, who arrived initially to convince him to abandon the protest, only to find themselves affected by the community's passionate defense of principles larger than individual gain. Uncle Paul, confronted with both his legal expertise and his childhood memories of the mountain his father had taught him to respect, found himself increasingly uncomfortable with Hargrove's methods, especially after reviewing Thomas's evidence of environmental violations that could potentially contaminate water supplies for years to come. As the day progressed, Thomas noticed his uncle engaged in intense conversation with former colleagues from environmental law practice, while Aunt Meredith distributed water bottles to elderly protesters, and even his cousins reluctantly helped distribute information flyers to gathering media representatives. By sunset, when the county sheriff arrived with environmental protection officials bearing cease and desist orders based on Thomas's evidence, the family stood together for the first time since his grandfather's death, watching with shared satisfaction as Hargrove's workers were instructed to power down equipment and vacate the site pending full investigation. Later that evening, as Thomas sat on the cabin porch beneath a star-filled sky, Uncle Paul joined him in uncharacteristic silence before finally speaking with genuine remorse. "Your grandfather would be proud of you, Thomas. He always said you understood what really mattered. I forgot that lesson somewhere along the way, but watching you today, I remembered." The county courthouse stood imposingly against the autumn sky as Thomas clutched his grandfather's leather-bound journals to his chest, the accumulated wisdom and scientific documentation within them representing their strongest legal weapon against Alpine Peak's violations. Miss Carter had connected the family with Judith Ramirez, an environmental attorney whose reputation for taking on corporate giants had earned her both admiration and notoriety throughout the state legal system. The preliminary hearing stretched across 3 tense days, with Thomas testifying about finding the hidden cavern and his grandfather's meticulous documentation of the watershed's vulnerability to mining contamination. Uncle Paul contributed his legal expertise, having rediscovered his environmental principles in the face of Hargrove's betrayal, while government inspectors presented soil and water samples already showing concerning levels of contaminants from the brief period of illegal operations. Judge Harrison, a silver-haired woman known for her thorough consideration of environmental cases, listened attentively as Ramirez systematically dismantled Alpine Peak's claims of proper permits and sustainable practices, using the grandfather's journals to demonstrate that Hargrove had specifically targeted areas Joseph Miller had identified as most ecologically sensitive. The courtroom erupted in subdued celebration when Judge Harrison granted their request for an immediate injunction, her ruling citing substantial evidence of permit violations and imminent threat to public water resources, while ordering a comprehensive environmental review before any operations could potentially resume. Thomas felt a surge of vindication as Hargrove's legal team gathered their papers with barely concealed frustration. The CEO himself, absent from proceedings after his initial testimony had been methodically contradicted by evidence from the journals. This sense of victory proved painfully short-lived, evaporating the following morning when Hargrove arrived unannounced at the cabin, accompanied by his personal attorney and a smug confidence that set alarm bells ringing in Thomas's mind. "Congratulations on your temporary legal success." Hargrove began without preamble, settling uninvited into grandfather's chair while his attorney distributed documents to the assembled family. However, business offers multiple avenues to achieve necessary outcomes when regulatory hurdles arise. Uncle Paul paled visibly as he reviewed the papers, legal training allowing him to quickly comprehend their implications. "He has purchased all outstanding debts held by our family," he explained to Thomas, voice tight with controlled anger. "The mortgage on my house, Meredith's medical bills, even the business loans for the store we had to close last year." Hargrove's smile never reached his eyes as he elaborated on his strategy. "Financial institutions are quite amenable to selling distressed debt at appropriate discounts. As the new holder of these obligations, I can demand immediate payment in full rather than honoring previous payment arrangements." The threat hung in the air with brutal clarity, Aunt Meredith clutching her husband's arm as the implications became clear. "Unless, of course, young Thomas reconsiders his opposition to our mining operations and shares the location of the primary mineral deposit his grandfather discovered." Thomas felt the weight of his family's frightened stares, their financial security now directly threatened by his continued resistance, creating a burden nearly unbearable for a 10-year-old, already shouldering his grandfather's environmental legacy. Hargrove's calculated attack had identified the precise vulnerability in Thomas's defense, exploiting family loyalty against environmental principles with cold efficiency. Even as Thomas struggled with this impossible choice, Rex growled from his position near the door where Eleanor and Miss Carter had just arrived, alerted by Uncle Paul's urgent call, their expressions hardening as they absorbed the scene before them. The battle had escalated beyond courtrooms and community protests into a deeply personal attack that threatened to tear apart the tentative family reconciliation Thomas had begun to cherish alongside his commitment to his grandfather's vision for the mountain. The confrontation with Hargrove left Thomas sleepless, the impossible choice between his family's financial security and his grandfather's environmental legacy, tormenting him through the darkest hours of night until he finally rose before dawn. Seeking clarity in the forest that had always provided solace, Rex accompanied him faithfully, the shepherd unusually focused as they traversed familiar paths gilded by early morning light filtering through autumn leaves beginning their transformation. Thomas had no specific destination in mind, wandering aimlessly while wrestling with Hargrove's ultimatum, until he noticed Rex forging ahead with unusual determination, occasionally looking back as if ensuring his young master followed. The dog led him to a remote section of the property rarely visited, a dense copse of ancient pines surrounding a small clearing where a peculiar rock formation protruded from the ground like the vertebrae of some massive stone creature. Thomas recognized the area from markings on his grandfather's map, though he had never understood its significance until Rex began digging insistently at a patch of ground partially concealed beneath fallen pine needles and moss, exposing what appeared to be a metal hatch similar to a storm cellar door but secured with a combination lock that had been carefully protected from the elements. The familiar pattern of numbers engraved on the stone in his pocket suddenly made sense, and with trembling fingers, Thomas entered the sequence, hearing the satisfying click of the mechanism releasing its hold. The heavy door required all his strength to lift, revealing stone steps descending into darkness that might have seemed forbidding if not for Rex's confident advance into the unknown depth. Using his flashlight, Thomas followed cautiously into a chamber unlike the mineral-laden cavern he had discovered during the blizzard, this space clearly modified by human hands into what resembled a monitoring station filled with gauges, filtration equipment, and precise measuring devices surrounding a central feature that took his breath away. A perfectly circular pool of water so clear it appeared almost luminous, bubbling gently from some unseen source deep within the mountain. The walls surrounding the pool were lined with his grandfather's familiar handwriting, years of meticulous measurements and observations documenting water quality, flow rates, and seasonal variations, alongside maps showing how this single spring connected to an elaborate underground network that supplied water to the entire valley watershed. Thomas knelt beside the pool in sudden understanding, his reflection rippling across its surface as clarity washed over him with the force of revelation. This was what his grandfather had truly protected all these years, not merely the mineral deposit but the pristine aquifer that nourished all life in the region for miles beyond their property. The journals on a nearby shelf confirmed his realization, containing comprehensive studies showing how the rare mineral deposit had formed in direct contact with the underground spring system, creating a unique geological formation where extracting one would inevitably contaminate the other with current mining techniques. His grandfather had understood that the true treasure beneath the mountain was not the valuable minerals, but the water itself, an irreplaceable resource that, once poisoned by mining operations, would devastate the ecosystem and human communities alike for generations. Photos and documents cataloged the spring's connection to every stream, river, and well in the surrounding communities, affecting thousands of lives who never realized their water originated from this single, vulnerable source. Most significant was the final journal entry Thomas discovered, addressed directly to him with instructions for using this ultimate evidence. His grandfather had registered the spring as a critical water resource with state environmental authorities years earlier, creating legal protections that superseded any mining claims regardless of mineral value, but had kept its precise location secret until the proper moment arrived to deploy this final, irrefutable defense against exploitation. The community hall overflowed with concerned citizens, journalists, environmental activists, and government officials gathered for the emergency hearing requested by Alpine Peak to challenge the continued injunction against their mining operations. Hargrove arrived with an entourage of corporate lawyers and paid experts, his confidence restored after filing formal documents threatening financial ruin for the Miller family if operations remained halted. Thomas sat between Eleanor and Uncle Paul at the front table, his grandfather's water monitoring journals and photographic documentation of the hidden spring arranged before him with meticulous care. Rex lying vigilantly at his feet as County Commissioner Williams opened proceedings with obvious concern about the tension filling the room. Alpine Peak Resources has requested reconsideration of mining permits based on economic necessity and strategic mineral importance. The commissioner began, nodding toward Hargrove, who rose immediately to present his case with practiced corporate smoothness, outlining the technological benefits of the rare mineral deposit, the jobs that mining operations would create, and thinly veiled references to legal consequences for those impeding progress. When Hargrove concluded his presentation, the commissioner turned expectantly toward Thomas, sympathy evident in his expression for the 10-year-old boy facing such formidable opposition. Thomas approached the podium carrying a single, clear container of water from the hidden spring, placing it carefully before speaking with a clarity that belied his years. "My grandfather discovered 2 treasures beneath our mountain," he began, voice steady despite his racing heart. "The rare minerals Mr. Hargrove wants to extract, and something far more precious that he never mentioned to you." Thomas unveiled detailed maps from his grandfather's monitoring station, showing how the hidden spring fed the entire regional watershed. This single water source supplies drinking water for every home in the valley, irrigates all agricultural land within 20 miles, and maintains the ecosystem that sustains wildlife throughout the protected forest. Miss Carter projected photographs of the monitoring station onto the hall's screen while Thomas continued, explaining how his grandfather had tracked water quality for decades, establishing baseline measurements that proved the spring's critical importance to regional water security. "The mineral deposit sits in direct contact with this water source," Thomas explained, directing attention to geological cross-sections in the documentation. "Any conventional mining would introduce toxic elements directly into the groundwater that feeds every faucet in every home represented in this room." Hargrove attempted to interrupt with counter-arguments about modern mining, safety, but fell silent when Thomas produced official state certification documents his grandfather had secured years earlier, designating the spring as a critical water resource entitled to highest-level environmental protection. "My grandfather understood that clean water is more valuable than any mineral," Thomas continued, meeting Hargrove's furious gaze without flinching. "He knew that true wealth isn't measured in stock prices or quarterly profits, but in resources that sustain life for generations. Uncle Paul stood to address legal implications, his voice reflecting newfound conviction as he outlined environmental regulations that prioritized critical water sources over mineral extraction rights, regardless of economic value. Commissioner Williams studied the documentation with increasing concern, particularly water quality data showing trace contaminants already present from Alpine Peak's brief illegal operations. "The mountain holds wealth that belongs to everyone," Thomas concluded, his voice strengthening with each word. "My grandfather protected this spring not just for our family, but for every person and creature that depends on clean water to survive. Some treasures can't be measured in dollars." As murmurs of agreement spread through the audience, Commissioner Williams called for an immediate vote on permanent protection status. Thomas watching with quiet satisfaction as years of his grandfather's meticulous preparation culminated in unanimous approval to designate the entire North Face as a critical watershed preserve, exempt from all extractive operations. Hargrove's threats dissolving before the more fundamental need for uncontaminated water that united the entire community across all political and economic divisions. Autumn painted the mountain in brilliant hues of amber and gold as Thomas stood on the cabin porch, watching visitors follow the newly established nature trail that wound through the property toward the small museum housed in what had once been his grandfather's workshop. 1 year had transformed both the land and the boy who had fought to protect it. Thomas, now taller and more confident, but still carrying the same reverence for the mountain that had defined his grandfather's life. Inside the cabin, Uncle Paul reviewed educational materials for tomorrow's school group, while Aunt Meredith prepared lunch for the volunteer guides, their lives permanently relocated from the city after recognizing what truly mattered during those tense days of confrontation and choice. The Alpine Peak Mining Corporation sign that once threatened the forest had been replaced with Miller Mountain Watershed Preserve, a designation that protected the land in perpetuity through a conservation trust. Established using settlement funds from Hargrove's illegal operations, the corporate CEO having faced both legal consequences and shareholder revolt after Thomas's revelations about the critical water source. The small museum had become a regional attraction, visitors from surrounding communities coming to view the interactive watershed model, showing how the hidden spring nourished the entire valley ecosystem. To examine historical photographs of Joseph Miller's environmental advocacy spanning decades, and most notably, to see the blue-veined rock displayed in a simple glass case at the center of the exhibit, its seemingly ordinary appearance belying its extraordinary significance. Beside it lay the journals documenting how one man's respect for natural systems had preserved an irreplaceable resource for generations yet unborn, and how a boy's courage to honor that vision had united a community against seemingly insurmountable corporate power. Thomas often guided these tours himself, explaining how technological advances were now making progress toward extraction methods that might someday access the valuable minerals without endangering the water supply, fulfilling his grandfather's belief that patience would eventually reconcile environmental protection with resource utilization. The family that had once abandoned Thomas over a worthless rock had found redemption in supporting the preservation efforts, his cousins now enthusiastically participating in water quality monitoring programs established through the local school, while Eleanor and old Jim served as honored advisors to the Conservation Trust Board that managed the preserve. Miss Carter had developed an environmental education curriculum based on Joseph Miller's research that was being implemented throughout the state, teaching children about watershed protection and sustainable resource management through the compelling story of Thomas and the hidden spring. Rex still accompanied Thomas everywhere, the loyal shepherd now accepting affectionate attention from visitors who recognized him from the newspaper photographs taken during the community protests that had united the valley in defense of their shared water future. On quiet evenings, when the visitors departed and silence reclaimed the mountain, Thomas would sometimes hold his grandfather's journals and feel profound gratitude for the legacy entrusted to him, understanding now that true inheritance resided not in material wealth, but in values passed from one generation to the next, like water flowing through the mountain's hidden chambers, nourishing all it touched. The rock that his family had once dismissed as worthless had ultimately revealed the most valuable lesson of all, that some treasures cannot be measured by market forces but must be valued in clean water, thriving wildlife, ancient forests, and communities united in protecting gifts meant for generations yet unborn, a legacy that would flow from this mountain long after all who fought for it had returned to the earth they had cherished enough to protect.